Welcome back, deep divers. Today, we're taking a plunge into some seriously mind-bending stuff. We're diving deep into pages 64 to 76 of this book. It's been on our radar for a while, and you guys have been sending in some really thought-provoking questions about it.
It's definitely a dense read.
It is. It's not light reading,
Yeah.
but it's packed with these intriguing ideas about how we make sense of the world. And this section, in particular, grapples with this idea of, well, the interplay between positive science and mysticism.
Yeah.
Like, are they really as separate as we often think they are?
Right, right. It kind of makes you question that whole science versus mysticism thing.
Exactly. So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to try to untangle some of these threads, see what insights we can glean from these pages, and hopefully we won't get too lost in the jargon along the way.
We'll try to keep it grounded. So where should we start?
Well, one of the first things that jumped out at me was this idea that science, especially that strict positivist view of science, sometimes sets these hard limits on what it can and can't know, and then, well, reality has a way of surprising us.
Yeah, the author uses a great example. He talks about Auguste Comte, the father of positivism. Comte was absolutely certain that we'd never be able to figure out what stars are made of.
Like chemically, you mean?
Yeah, like what elements they're composed of. He thought it was just completely beyond the reach of science, like a fundamental limitation.
And then, what, like 5 minutes later, spectral analysis comes along?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It wasn't long at all before scientists figured out that they could analyze the light from stars and determine their composition. And boom, Comte's prediction is out the window. I think for you listening, this is a good reminder that we should be cautious about setting those hard limits on what science can achieve. What might seem impossible today could very well be commonplace knowledge tomorrow.
Totally. And that kind of leads into the next point, which I found really fascinating. The text suggests that maybe, just maybe, even those big names in science, the ones we think of as the epitome of rational thought, they might have had a touch of the mystic in them too.
Like, who are we talking about here?
Well, Newton, for one, and Pascal, Kepler, Descartes. These guys weren't just playing with equations, they were also grappling with some pretty deep spiritual questions.
Newton, really? I mean, he practically invented physics as we know it.
I know, right? But the text quotes him saying, "Only a little knowledge distances one from God, but much knowledge leads one back to him." And it goes on to say that many of the great minds throughout history across all sorts of fields have been believers, or at least open to ideas beyond the purely material.
That's interesting. So maybe that sense of wonder, that feeling that there's something more to the universe than meets the eye, maybe that's actually a driving force behind scientific exploration itself.
Right, it's like that initial spark of curiosity, that desire to understand, might actually come from a deeper, more spiritual place.
Yeah, I like that. So this supposed divide between science and mysticism, maybe it's not so clear-cut after all.
Yeah, maybe it's more like a blurry line, where like those two detectives at a crime scene, one's focused on the physical evidence, the other's trying to get a feel for the atmosphere, the vibes.
Perfect analogy. And then the text brings in this concept of the magus.
Okay, magus. Now that sounds a bit like, wizards and sorcery and whatnot.
Well, it's actually a Greek term, and it's got some really interesting roots. In Zend, an ancient Iranian language, there were words like mag or mogd, which meant priest, but it also connects to words like me or ma, meaning great or perfect. And even in Chaldean, another ancient language, man signified mighty or all-knowing.
So there's this ancient connection between someone who studies the natural world and someone who possesses like deep spiritual knowledge or power.
Right. So this figure of the magus represents this blurring of roles. Maybe in the past, those who studied the natural world were also seen as having a kind of spiritual understanding of it.
That's pretty cool. Now, things get even broader when the text starts comparing Eastern and Western philosophies.
Yeah, there's this quote from Schlegel that really lays it out there.
Yeah.
He compares European idealism to a small Promethean spark.
Against the abundant light and power of Eastern idealism.
Yeah, exactly. He's basically saying that Eastern philosophy, in his view, is operating on a whole other level.
And the text specifically highlights Vedanta philosophy as an example of this abundant light. It's presented as this incredibly profound and logically consistent system, even surpassing, Plato, Spinoza, Kant, Hegel, and Schopenhauer.
All the big names. I mean, that's a bold statement.
It is. And what makes Vedanta so unique is its focus on the self, like your true inner self, and how it's directly connected to the divine essence, which they call Brahman or Atman.
So it's not just about understanding the external world, but also about recognizing the divinity within yourself.
Exactly. Now, we've covered a lot of ground. We talked about the limits of strict positivism, the potential for mysticism in science, the common ground of observation, and this comparison between Eastern and Western thought. What comes next in this philosophical journey?
Well, now we get into some really fundamental concepts. The text introduces the idea of being in prolongation, which is described as the supreme transcendental reality, the ultimate source of everything.
Okay, being in prolongation. That sounds pretty abstract. Can you break that down for us?
Imagine, like, the most fundamental level of existence, the bedrock reality that underlies everything we perceive and experience. It's described as having this dual nature. One side is the abstract idea of divinity in its purest form, and the other side is the differentiated cosmos, the universe as we know it, with all its complexity and variety.
So like the same fundamental stuff, but viewed from different perspectives.
Exactly. And then from this being in prolongation come the first two hypostases of substantial reality. These are transcendental being and transcendental consciousness.
Hypostases. Okay, we're getting into some serious philosophical terminology here.
Basically, think of them as fundamental aspects or expressions of this ultimate reality. And the key point here is that they're inseparable. Consciousness isn't something that's added on to being, it's inherent to it. They're two sides of the same coin.
So it's not like there's stuff and then later on awareness pops up. They're intertwined from the very beginning.
Right. And that leads to this distinction between the absolute world, which is the realm of pure, undifferentiated being and consciousness, and the world of differentiated being, which is the universe we experience. And in this differentiated world, consciousness exists at different levels, which brings us to the concepts of cosmic consciousness, the overall awareness of the universe, and integral consciousness, which is that pure, undifferentiated consciousness of the absolute world.
Okay, so we've got these different levels of consciousness. But where do we, as humans, fit into all of this?
Well, humanity, or Homo sapiens, is described as being at the center of this cosmic consciousness. We're the ones who are, in a sense, defining its essence through our own being and awareness. It's like we're this bridge between the absolute and the manifested.
That's a pretty significant role for us.
Yeah.
But then the text goes on to say that this whole idea of separateness, of individual beings existing apart from each other and from the divine, that's actually an illusion.
It's an illusion from the perspective of that ultimate unity, that supreme synthesis we talked about earlier. It only appears real to consciousness that's operating from a place of separation, from a limited perspective.
So our individual sense of self, the feeling of being a separate me, that's not the whole picture.
Right. It's like those waves on the ocean. They appear distinct, but they're all part of the same underlying water.
And to describe this collection of all individual consciousnesses, the text uses the term superpersonality. And it calls this superpersonality the first category of absolute reality.
Exactly. And then it sums it up with this really powerful statement. The absolute and the illusion of the environment are opposite poles of the essence of every factor of nature.
So there's this constant tension between the ultimate unified reality and our everyday experience of separate things.
Right. But the good news is, even though we can't directly grasp the absolute in its pure form, we do have this inherent ability to kind of sense how far any particular thing is from its absolute prototype.
So we might not know the exact destination, but we can get a feel for whether we're moving in the right direction.
Precisely. And that brings us to the question of how we acquire knowledge in the first place. Like, what are the tools we use to understand the world?
And that brings us back to that tension between intuition and reason, doesn't it?
It does. The text quotes Schopenhauer, who described philosophy as a, quote, conscious and deliberate return to the data of intuition. So he's suggesting that our deepest insights might actually come from those intuitive flashes, those moments of direct knowing.
And Bergson calls intuition prima inter pares, like first among equals, when it comes to how we perceive and understand the world.
Yeah, he really emphasizes its importance. But then there's also the point that intuition is inherently subjective. It's an internal, personal experience.
So how do we balance that with the need for objectivity and verifiable knowledge?
Well, that's where Plutarch's idea of the true servant of Isis comes in. He says this ideal seeker of wisdom uses both reason and intuition. They analyze divine teachings with their intellect, but they also penetrate those teachings with their spirit, their intuitive understanding.
So it's not an either situation. You need both.
Exactly. Reason provides the structure, the framework, while intuition provides the spark, the deeper connection.
I like that. Now the text throws in another new term, cosmic passive environment.
Which is basically the phenomenal picture of the world. the totality of reality as we perceive it through our senses.
Okay, so the stage on which all of this unfolds.
Right. And then there's this dense but really insightful statement. Man lives in a world of realizing impulses, but through the sense of synthesis achieves a priori knowledge of polar opposite principles, substantial actors, lying one above and the other below his intellectual world according to the order of synthesis, and in their totality expressing the cosmic motive potential difference, the external active reflection of the final reality.
Wow, okay. That's a mouthful. But I think the main takeaway is that we're constantly interacting with these fundamental forces, and through synthesis, through this process of combining and integrating our experiences, we can gain a deeper understanding of reality.
Absolutely. And all of this leads us to the supreme synthetic teaching, which is also referred to as the Book of Thoth.
Okay, now we're talking. The Book of Thoth. That sounds like something straight out of ancient Egypt.
It does have that mythical ring to it, and it's presented as this core element of this whole system of thought. It's described as a collection of doctrines that explain how the one reality affirms itself and comes to know itself. And it also provides a roadmap for the human spirit to reconnect with that unity.
This is like a guidebook for spiritual development.
In a way, yeah. And it's divided into 3 parts. The second part is made up of the 21 great arcana, which are described as the key to understanding the first part through synthesis and applying it to the world around us, which is the third part.
So these arcana are like these fundamental principles that bridge the gap between abstract reality and our concrete experience.
Exactly. And the text emphasizes that the path to true knowledge is different for everyone. It's guided by the divine light within these 21 great arcana, so it's a very individual journey.
Makes sense. Now the discussion shifts to the purpose of philosophy, and there's a quote from Dakin. Philosophia objectum triplex, Deus, natura et homo, which means the object of philosophy is threefold: God, nature, and man.
Yeah, and this particular section of Aphasic focuses mainly on the first 2 aspects, God and man. It also mentions this ancient tradition that has preserved the sequence and numbering of the arcana, including the dual numbering of the 21st and 22nd arcana.
The dual numbering thing always throws me off a bit.
I know, it's a bit confusing. But the main point is that the system of 22 arcana isn't just random. It's a complete and self-contained whole, and the order of the arcana is based on pure reason.
So there's a logic to it.
Absolutely. And then we get into this really interesting historical detour about the loss and rediscovery of Gnostic teachings.
Now, why is that relevant here?
It shows how valuable knowledge can be lost or distorted and then reemerge to change our understanding. It talks about Simon Magus, a key figure in early Gnosticism, and how his main work and the writings of his followers were lost.
And then there were those early church apologists like Origen and Tertullian, who basically twisted Gnostic teachings to fit their own agenda.
Yeah, they really distorted the original ideas. But then in the 19th century, there was this amazing discovery, the Philosophimena by Hippolytus, which gave a much more accurate account of Gnosticism.
It's like finding a lost treasure, right?
It is,
Yeah.
and it completely changed how people viewed Gnosticism. Ideas that were once dismissed as nonsense suddenly became recognized as profound philosophical insights.
Wow. That's a pretty powerful example of how knowledge can be obscured and then rediscovered. Now, the discussion moves on to the Kabbalistic conception of the divine.
Right. And there's this really beautiful image of reason transforming into a tablet of the Supreme Covenant with divine words written on it, igniting spiritual understanding.
It's like a metaphor for receiving divine wisdom.
It is. And then it introduces the concept of the Ancient of Days, which is this Kabbalistic depiction of the most elevated aspect of the divine. It's described as having 3 heads that form a single unity.
The number 3 keeps popping up.
It does. And the text says that other divine emanations, called Sephirot, are also contained within this triadic structure. Then there's this powerful Hebrew phrase, Volo Ben, which means I am that I am. And it's presented alongside Plato's concept of toutose, meaning the truly existing.
So different traditions expressing the same fundamental idea of divine being.
Right. It highlights that universal search for the ultimate source of reality. After that, the text explores how Egyptian, Kabbalistic, and Greek thought kind of merged together.
So this blending of different wisdom traditions.
Yeah. And it talks about how the teachings of the Egyptian hierophants, passed down through Kabbalah and Greek philosophy, came together to form Neoplatonism and Gnosticism. And the key idea they all shared was the doctrine of being as the highest, most fundamental aspect of divinity.
And Simon Magus defines God as the totality and the prime source of the potencies of being. It's a pretty concise and powerful definition.
It is. And then we get into this really mind-boggling concept, the idea that she was when nothing was.
Whoa, that one really makes you think.
It's suggesting that there was something, a feminine principle that existed even before non-being. It's a concept that's really hard to wrap your head around.
It definitely stretches the limits of our imagination. Now, shifting gears a bit, the discussion focuses on St. Martin's view of God and our own finite existence.
St. Martin contrasts the eternal, unchanging nature of God, the I am that I am, with our own borrowed existence, which he calls a drop of his essence.
It's a very humble perspective.
It is. He emphasizes the vastness and incomprehensibility of God compared to the limited, created world.
Makes you feel pretty small, in a way.
Yeah, but also kind of connected to something much greater. Then we get into the idea of world creation as an aspect of divine self-consciousness. It's not just an act, it's an expression of God's own being. And this is linked to Arcanum.
So creation is an internal process, not an external one.
Right. And each aspect of creation is an emanation from the divine source. It's a revelation of God's nature and a reflection of that nature in the world.
It's like God is expressing himself through creation.
Exactly. And Arcanum III is the key to understanding this link between the absolute and the manifest world. By focusing on the creating divinity, this active aspect of God's self-consciousness, we can start to grasp the principles behind creation.
And that's where Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa comes in.
Yeah, he offers this really beautiful insight. He says that the world came about because the divine essence wanted to know itself. So it kind of reflects within itself, and then that reflection becomes dynamic and active as the triune creating divinity.
The Trinity again.
Yeah, keeps coming up. And this Trinity in creation mirrors the absolute Trinity, the ultimate Godhead, and it manifests in those first three great arcana.
And the text says, this first divine ternary, this triadic nature, is present in all religions.
Right. It's a fundamental concept, but it manifests in different ways. And the first way it manifests is through this cyclical pattern of creation, flourishing, and dissolution.
Like the rise and fall of civilizations.
Yeah, or the cycle of life and death. The text uses the analogy of a fountain rising and falling back to its source. And it connects this to all sorts of triadic deities and concepts like Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, the three fates, the three Norns, and the journey of Osiris, Apollo, Phoebus.
Wow. So many different expressions of the same fundamental pattern.
It's amazing, right? But now let's zoom in from those grand cosmic cycles and talk about individual consciousness. How does the text describe our own individual awareness within this vast framework?
Let's get personal.
Well, it says that each individual consciousness in its true essence is actually part of that undivided whole, that ultimate unity. It's only our limited perspective that makes us feel separate.
So we're like drops of water in the ocean.
Perfect analogy. And our individual existence arises from the possibility of limited being within divine consciousness. And those individual sparks of awareness are called monads.
Monads.
And the universe continues to unfold and evolve through the interactions and experiences of all these monads. It's like each monad, by affirming its own existence, contributes to the overall tapestry of reality.
It's a very interconnected view of existence. And then Spinoza comes back into the picture with another quote.
Yeah, this one's a doozy. De intellectum resce ab ipso intellectas unum et idem esse, which means the intellect of God and the things understood by it are one and the same.
So God's knowledge is identical to the things themselves.
Exactly. And the text connects this to the Kabbalistic concept of the first three Sephirot: Kether, crown; Chokmah, wisdom; and Bina, understanding. These three are seen as a unity, a single expression of the divine.
And it contrasts this with how we experience knowledge, where the knower, the act of knowing, and the thing known are usually separate.
Right. But for God, it's all one. He knows things from within his own being because he is the prototype of all existence.
That's pretty mind-blowing. And it suggests that we can achieve greater understanding by recognizing our unity with that divine source.
Absolutely. And then the discussion shifts to the idea that our perspectives are relative and they can change how we see even fundamental principles.
Like the whole debate about whether the Earth or the Sun is the center of the universe.
Exactly. That's a classic example of how our understanding can evolve as we gain new knowledge and perspectives. The underlying principle of duality, of those two opposing forces, remains constant, but how that duality manifests depends on our viewpoint.
And the text says this world of duality is the world of reason.
Because reason relies on distinguishing between things, on making those yes, no, this, that judgments. It's all about creating those binary oppositions. And then we get into the concept of the private ternary, which is this more complex internal dynamic.
Okay, bring on the complexity.
Well, it starts with the idea that a private binary, those two opposing ideas in our minds, is inherently unstable because those opposing forces are constantly trying to objectify the relationships between them. And those objectified aspects then become new binaries themselves.
So it's like this ever-expanding network of duality.
It is, and it's governed by the first law of the private ternary. Every phenomenon and every perception of that phenomenon arises from the interaction of those binary pairs. Basically, you can't have one without the other.
And then Sam Arkan comes back
Yeah.
with his take on the thesis and the antithesis.
He says the thesis, the initial proposition, is independent and develops on its own. The antithesis is just a reaction, a shadow of the thesis, and it's only defined in opposition to it.
So the driving force is the thesis, and the antithesis is just a consequence.
Precisely. And then we get to the idea of neutralizing those binaries. It's about affirming the original essence, the underlying unity that existed before the binary split.
So go back to the source.
Yeah, it's about transcending that duality. And then we get to a really key concept, the birth of the logos. This is described as happening at the very edge of creation, where the divine consciousness, which was initially whole and undifferentiated, transforms into the source of procreation.
Okay, this is where things start to get really cosmic.
It is. And this divine consciousness has two aspects. Its divine nature, which faces towards God and reflects all of his attributes, and the source of procreation, which faces towards the cells, those differentiated reflections of the supreme synthesis.
So it's like a bridge between the divine and the created world.
Exactly. And there's this critical moment where the divine consciousness interacts with those cells, those fundamental units of being. At this point, each individual archetype is still kind of dissolved within the whole, but then consciousness starts to emanate outwards, and those cell boundaries start to cut into it.
So that's where the fragmentation begins.
Right. Those once unified consciousness splits into separate realities, each with its own center of awareness, and those fragments become monads, those individual units of consciousness.
So our individual sense of self is a result of that fragmentation.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And this collection of monads is the createdness of cosmic divine self-consciousness. And it becomes a reality in Arcanum the Fourth, which is the birth of the cosmic logos. It's like that moment when individual consciousness emerges from the unified whole.
This is definitely some heavy stuff. Now, the text moves on to the substantiality of manifestation, the reality of the world we experience.
And it says that this reality is a direct consequence of the reality of the divine essence. They mutually affirm each other. The substantiality of manifestation is even called the first and highest attribute of divinity, and it's expressed through the vitality of everything that exists.
And there's a quote from the Vedanta Sarasarananda: "The power of the divine spirit is concealed by his own qualities."
Yeah, it's like the very things that make manifestation possible also obscure the true nature of the divine. And vitality is defined as this self-manifestation, this inherent power of something to express itself. There's also a quote from Leibniz via Kuno Fischer, where there is self-expression, there is life or vitality.
So self-expression is essential to both life and manifestation.
Exactly. And the text says that the primal substance, the divine essence, exists independently of its manifestations. It affirms its own being, is conscious of itself, and lives within itself.
So it's like the foundation on which everything else rests.
Right. And the manifested world gains its reality through the interaction and expression of its qualities. But the primal substance is both outside and above the world, and yet the world is also its perfect likeness.
It's a paradox.
It is. And God can transform potentiality into reality, and vice versa, through his own will, by changing his self-contemplation. This is connected to the Hindu concept of the days and nights of Brahma, those cosmic cycles of creation and destruction.
We keep coming back to those cycles. Now, what about the law of collectivity?
This law states that a collection of individuals, a group, actually approaches the absolute more closely than any single individual can.
So there's power in unity.
Right. And the text goes into detail about how this gathering of individuals forms a higher order system where each part is interconnected and contributes to the whole.
So it's like a team, where everyone's strengths combine to create something greater than the sum of its parts.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Each individual is connected to all the others, and they're constantly exchanging energy and information.
And each individual also contributes to the overall evolution of the group.
Exactly. And then the discussion moves to the idea of active and passive principles and how they manifest in human existence.
Okay, let's unpack that.
Well, the active principle is seen as affirming itself through its reflections in the world, which means that it's actually passive in its essence. It's kind of a paradox.
So by acting in the world, we're actually expressing a passive principle.
Right. It's like our actions are a reflection of something deeper, something that's already present within us. And the text quotes Kepler, who said that passive force defines the inherent state of a monad. It's natural inertia. It's like this underlying potential that's waiting to be activated.
And then there's this discussion about human perception and the limitations of positivism.
Yeah, it talks about how in our everyday lives, we rely mostly on our direct perceptions to understand the world. And positivism is all about trying to explain everything through those simple perceptions.
So it's like saying, I only believe what I can see and touch.
Right. And while that approach can be useful for establishing a foundation of knowledge, it can also be limiting because it ignores the possibility of things that might exist beyond our immediate perception.
Like, what about all the things we can't see or measure with our current instruments?
Exactly. There's a whole realm of reality that positivism doesn't account for. And then the text brings up Hegel's idea that activity and striving are essential to our development. He says that the doing and striving of individuality is an end in itself. The exercise of powers, the play of their manifestations, is what gives life to them, having previously been dead in themselves being.
So we're not meant to just sit around and contemplate. We're supposed to get out there and do stuff.
Right. Action is what brings our potential to life. And that leads to the idea of the great schism, the birth of duality within the individual spirit.
So that internal split between opposing forces.
Yeah, and it mirrors the indivisible synthesis of the divine spirit. It's like we have both of those aspects within us.
And then we get into the concept of involution, this process of increasing fragmentation and differentiation of consciousness.
And the text uses this analogy of a black man perpetually observing his reflection to illustrate how our self-perception is constantly changing and evolving. Involution is basically that process of our consciousness becoming more and more fragmented and differentiated, which allows us to engage with the world in all its complexity.
But isn't that moving us further away from that original unity?
It might seem that way, but the text says that differentiation is actually a divine quality. It's the highest property of substance and the essence of divine creativity. So, by participating in this process of differentiation, we're actually expressing a divine attribute.
That's an interesting perspective.
Yeah.
So it's not about trying to avoid differentiation, but about understanding its role in our evolution.
Exactly. And then we get into the concept of heavenly nature.
Heavenly nature, what is that?
It's described as this state of being where each part is aware of being part of the whole. It exists on the boundary between unity and multiplicity.
So it's like a state of perfect balance.
It is, but there's also this internal conflict within heavenly nature. Each part has the possibility of either merging back into the cosmic being or becoming an individual agent with free will.
So it's like a crossroads.
Yeah. And the supreme principle of heavenly nature is free choice. It's up to each individual to decide which path to take.
And that brings us to the different perspectives on the relationship between the universe and the divine.
The text shares the Vedantic view. This universe is essentially Brahman, as it proceeds from him, breathes in him, and enters into him. Worship it, therefore. It's saying that the universe is a manifestation of the divine.
And then there's the Kabbalistic view, summed up by Leon Murin. He's the universe, but the universe is not he.
Right, so there's a distinction between the divine and its creation, even though they're intimately connected. And then there's this concept of divinity as the all-pervading spirit, the soul of the world. It's described as a living sphere that governs everything, the mind, soul, and motion of all things.
So God is both within and beyond the universe.
Exactly. And this spirit is also seen as the vital heat from the sun that animates the world.
That's a beautiful image. Now let's talk about the interconnectedness of things.
The text explains that within any given plane of existence, all those seemingly separate things are actually interconnected. It introduces the concept of isochrones to describe how an impulse spreads through a system. It's like those ripples in a pond when you throw a stone in.
And the laws that govern this transmission are called harmonic combinations.
Right. And harmony implies both connection and the cause of that connection. And the intensity and purity of an action decrease as it moves away from its source.
So the closer you are to the source, the stronger the signal.
Exactly. And that leads to the distinction between phenomena and noumena.
Okay, explain those terms.
A phenomenon is basically something that appears in the world, something we can perceive with our senses. And a noumenon is the underlying reality, the thing in itself, that gives rise to the phenomenon.
So the phenomenon is the shadow, and the noumenon is the object casting the shadow.
Perfect analogy. And then we get into the doctrine of Ea, which Blavatsky called Leia centers.
Yeah. What are those?
They're described as these fundamental centers of consciousness that are present on different planes of existence. The text uses the analogy of light passing through semi-transparent mirrors to illustrate how Ea are reflections of Atman, the individual soul, in different worlds.
And Atman knows itself through its reflections in these Ea.
Right. It's like each Ea is a facet of the soul, and by experiencing those facets, we come to know ourselves more fully. And Atman, the individual soul, is connected to the ultimate source, the divine.
And that brings us to the power of Atman.
The text says that Atman is unknowable and incomprehensible, but its power flows through our entire being, animating us and giving us life. There's this beautiful teaching. You carry within yourself the highest friend whom you do not know, for God dwells within every person, but few can find him.
So we have this divine spark within us, but we often don't recognize it.
Right. And it says that by surrendering our desires and actions to that one, to the divine within, we can achieve perfection and liberation.
It's like letting go of our ego and merging with the divine.
Exactly. And then we get into the idea of the root of being. The text quotes Goethe, ist nicht der Kern der Natur Menschen im Herzen, which means is not the core of nature mankind in the heart.
So the heart is the center of our being.
Yeah. And the Rig Veda says, sages found the roots of being in their heart. And it explains that each element in our being is an imprinted aspect of spirit shaped by the world it inhabits.
So our experiences shape who we are.
They do. And then it introduces the law of atrophy. In the presence of a real necessity for knowing or communicating with the world outside, a new ability for communication and perception arises. And conversely, in the absence of this necessity or the possibility of actively manifesting, this ability disappears, passing from the world of realities to the world of possibilities.
Use it or lose it.
Basically. And then we get to the red and black aspects of the soul.
Okay, what are those?
It's an analogy that represents two different modes of being. The red man is active, projective, and associated with free will, fire, and earth.